Should I share?
This meeting is being recorded.
Got it. All right, can I share screen now?
Yes, she made you co-host, so you should be able to.
Okay, before I begin, I'd like to say that I just want to get a feeling of how many people, just raise your hands, are native Austinites in this group. Can anyone raise their hand? How many that were born actually in Austin?
Not born.
Okay. How
Been
many-
here since 63 though.
Okay. Who has been here? So only one person was actually born in Austin that's in this group?
No one.
No one. Well, neither was I, so we're all in the same group together. Can I get a sense of how long people have lived here? Over 20 years, hands up? Over 40 years. Okay, so a couple of you are going to remember the 70s in Austin very well, which I'm going to be talking about quite a lot. So I'm going to switch and go to it. Go to share screen. And let me see now what happens. You would think I would know after all these years of having on Zoom that how to do this, but I still don't know how to do it.
I don't
All
blame
right.
you.
So let me pull you all over here. I'm not teaching this semester and I have completely forgotten how to deal with this whole online world. It's easy to forget. So let's start. Now, I was asked to, let me see how this come up. Okay, let me come up. I'm going to try to put this on. What's this going on here? Done. I was trying to put this on presenter mode. No, done. So that I could see it while you're talking, as I have notes, but I guess I'll have to just kind of wing it. All right, so can everyone see?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So although I'm mostly going to be, I'm going to be talking about the making of Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, I consider it a really interesting chapter in the history of Austin. And so in order to sort of set it up, we kind of probably do need to talk a bit about the history of Austin a bit. So
And I'm going to interrupt 1 second, and I apologize in advance. If folks can mute themselves, because I've been hearing noise, and Erna would prefer questions as they come up as opposed to waiting to the end. So if you have one, raise your hand or do the, digital doohickey or whatever. Okay, thanks.
yeah, I kind of like things a little bit more conversational. I'm not talking to 20-year-olds. So this, I'd like to have a conversation. So that's why I just jump in whenever you feel like, if I say something you don't understand or you have a question about, let me know. So coming up, just to give you an idea, I'm just going to sort of very quickly go through some major events in Austin Black history from the end of slavery through the 1960s, talk a little bit about how the
Erna, you just muted yourself somehow.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All right, but first I'm going to talk just a little bit about myself so you know who you're talking to. Jenny did a good job of making me sound very important and accomplished. But in reality, I kind of think of myself mostly as like a fourth generation Texan. This is called Teals Prairie. It's outside Caldwell, Texas. And this is where my family is from, my father's family. And all of them, most of the Smiths are buried there. My great grandfather was brought to this state as a slave from Virginia. We don't know what year it was. His slave owner was named Benjamin Smith, and Benjamin went off to fight the Civil War. Apparently he got killed. His wife was left with this land and no way to sort of farm it. So she at first leased it to my great grandfather and his brother. And then eventually they bought something like 440 acres, which remain in my family to this day. It is a meaning. I grew up in the military, however. My father left the country, he went to Prairie View and he was drafted actually in World War II after the Battle of the Bulge, I believe it was, because he was an agriculture teacher and they all had exemptions. But after that, they just wanted everybody in there. So he went into the military. And then in 1947, with the stroke of a pen, Harry Truman integrated the military and decided that they could have Black officers. And my father had a college degree. And looking at the choice of coming back to Texas or having a career in the military, he chose the military. It's a much better chance for him. So I grew up on racially integrated military bases in France, Germany, Texas, and Virginia. So I often like to tell my students, I grew up during the era of Jim Crow, but mostly I just visited whenever I came to Texas. Otherwise, I didn't have a lot of experience of it. I had a little, but not a lot, just enough to kind of know that it was, that segregation was kind of messed up. But anyway, that's who I am. And that's what kind of informs my thinking about everything about Texas, about history, about the importance, in particular me as an African-American, to know my history in this state. Also, I should say that Texas, I think, has a very unique civil rights history because of it's a triracial state, Black, brown, and white. And it was a republic. The state is very interesting. And so I think there's a great book for someone to write in how that all kind of plays out, because it's very unique. It's not like the Deep South, though it's a Deep South. And it's certainly not like the North. So at any rate, that's me. And so what I want to start talking about was just a little bit of a brief history here. Now, most of the material that I'm going to be sort of pulling facts from come from basically three resources. I did a lot of research of the Austin History Center, which I consider to be one of the great things about Austin. To me, it's better than Barton Springs, because this is such a rich collection of things down there. The people are so nice, and it's in a wonderful old building, and I can't recommend it enough just to go down there and hang out. The archivists are wonderful people. But there are only 3 pieces that I could find there that were written by African Americans about African Americans. And so it's just really not a lot, but more and more are coming online every day. So the 3 pieces are 2 are by this guy, his name is J. Mason Brewer, who was a noted folklorist, not an Austinite, but a Texan. And he did this overview with his class at Houston-Tillotson College in 1940. He wrote another piece, booklet, in the 50s about East Austin, which is just incredible. And then the third one is actually a document written by a guy named W.H. Passon, who was the pastor of Metropolitan AME Church, which he wrote in 1907 to commemorate the church's 25th anniversary. And all of these are really sort of booklets that sort of just kind of list facts. So I thought I'd start with this one. So Mason Brewer, J. Mason Brewer wrote that the advent of the Negro in Travis County coincides practically with that of the white man. In other words, Black people were brought here by white people. And I don't know why that line just hit me when I read it. And I said, oh, well, that makes complete sense. So this was actually the first Black person in Austin. If you kind of look at her, you can see she didn't look that Black. She was mulatto. She was apparently part Indian and I think Black on one side and then white or something on the other. Her name was Mahalia Murchison. She was the slave girl of the wife of the Murchisons. I forgot the original Murchison's name. And she's actually listed as the very first one. As you can see, she was very fair. She probably could pass, but you know, she was the very first one. And apparently at some point, a man named Isaac Strain, a white man, he wanted to marry her, but allegedly she didn't want to go with him. So she didn't marry him and she stayed with the Murchisons. But she had 6 children by Isaac Strain. And they became an incredibly noted mulatto, or they're considered Black family in Austin, named the Strains. And this is a picture of them. The man second to your right is named Frank Strain. That was one of her, she had 3 sons, she had 6 children, 3 sons, 3 daughters. And he was the one that she was closest to. She lived with him all her life. Now, what is interesting is where they lived. They lived in what sounds like, I guess it was probably called, well, it wasn't Wheatsville. They lived in a white neighborhood near UT, and they were just allowed to be there. I don't know how that happened, but that's where they grew up. They were all very well educated and became teachers and stuff like that. So this was really the first family, and their proximity to whiteness was, I think, pretty close. And it affected the way they affected their lives. There's still some descendants of them still around, but not many. Most of them left Austin. Now, after emancipation, the first thing that people started doing was actually building churches, of course. And the first 3 were First Baptist, which later became Ebenezer Baptist Church. Then came Wesley United Methodist Church. And the third one was Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, all three of these churches still exist. As a matter of fact, Metropolitan was going to be celebrating its 140th anniversary next month. So they're still there, they still operate. The populations that go there are dwindling, they're aging, but these churches are still going on, and they could all be found in what is now called the Central East Austin Heritage District. So they're all still there. But that's the first thing people did, was build churches. Now, just to give you an idea of just population growth of Black people, this is from, I think this census is from 1870 and 1880. Now, if you look at them, what you see is that about 1 in 3 people that are living in Austin in 1870 and 1880 were Black. Does anyone know what the percentage is today?
It ain't good. It's like,
8%.
yeah, I was gonna say 7 or 8, yeah.
Yeah, it's 8.1. So it's less than 1 in 10 now, but at one point it was 1 in 3. This was really not unusual for cities after the Civil War at all. One thing that happened in Austin was that, it was taken over by the federal government after the Civil War. And actually, George Armstrong Custer was like over the town for a while. You should read his wife's letters about how uncivilized she thought Texans were. But at any rate, it was also where they put the Freedmen's Bureau. After the Civil War, they created these bureaus for refugees to help newly freed Black people and also poor whites who were harmed by the war. So, and then in general, the cities also all became a little bit more prominent, after wars, Civil War, we can talk about the World War II in a moment. So a lot of cities across the South had pretty large Black populations. But I did find it interesting when I saw it 1 in 3 versus less than 1 in 10 now. It's interesting. So what happened was, with the coming of freedom and people were no longer enslaved, people began to settle all across Austin. And this is a map of what is known as the early freedmen communities, of which there were, this map shows like altogether 12. Many people think there were more. So Black people were mostly living in the central city around UT and the Capitol, and going further west, Clarksville and all that. So this was where the majority of Black people lived, in these scattered small settlements. Some were bigger than others. The last one that they created was actually east of the freeway, called Gregorytown, which later became the Blackshear neighborhood, which is now where Huston-Tillotson College is, right in that area. But at any rate, these were all over the city. Does anyone know what happened? How come? Because we know at some point, I'm sure all of you who've been in Austin long enough to know that East Austin has become sort of synonymous with where Black people at least used to live. Does anyone have any idea how that might have happened?
Yep. The 1928 master plan, where they said if colored people wanted city services, water, sewage, schools, parks, they had to move east of I-35.
Yeah, that's what happened. It was the city plan of 1928. It was done by some. Now, what's interesting about it is that the reason why they did that, the Supreme Court had ruled in 1917 that cities could no longer pass ordinances. They said it was unconstitutional to pass ordinances that limited where people could live. So housing rates for cities to actually segregate neighborhoods was against the law. So in order to get around the law, a lot of people did the same thing. They used coercion. As Jenny was saying, they put the schools, all the segregated schools were placed on the east side, and the only high school. And also other services over the years came in there, like parks and swimming pools and stuff like that. But at first it was the schools. And anybody who resisted moving was basically, the city in a way colluded with the utility companies, who agreed, well, we just won't give them services, or we won't expand services. So when I came to Austin, my father retired in 1970 from the military. He moved us here. I remember driving into Clarksville. I always knew when I was getting there, because suddenly there wasn't street lights as many. And I remember there were some dirt roads and chickens and stuff. To me, it was like going to the country to go to Clarksville. And the same thing with the St. John's area, which is off I-35, just above, east of I-35, right at about, I don't know where to describe it, almost at 290. And I remember going in there, and it was the same kind of thing. And then as a journalist, seeing that same sort of thing in other cities. I worked in Waco. Waco had some unincorporated area in the middle of the city where Black people lived that had no services. So it was kind of a thing, I think, in Texas, but that's essentially what happened. But I think it's important to note that it was more of a kind of a white glove kind of racism. It wasn't that kind of vicious stuff that you saw in other places where they went and just basically ran people out by violence. It was coercion. And that's been, I think, kind of a feature of sort of race relations in Austin for a very long time. It's a much more polite and educated kind of crowd. So I think that's very true. So, much happened between 1928 and the 70s. I don't want to go through all of it. I will touch on a couple of subjects. First was, in addition to making East Austin, quote, the Negro district, it also was zoned for mixed use. So any kind of undesirable industry was put over there. Anything unsightly, undesirable, dumps, things of this sort were put there. So, so what happened was that it became a place of not only where Black people, but also where businesses that people didn't want to see were located. Now, in the 1950s, there was a former mayor here named Tom Miller, who I understand was a really great mayor. And he decided that he wanted to do something to clean up, quote, the blight in East Austin. One of the things I discovered in my research is that this sort of image of Jim Crow and segregation as being, de facto inferior or somehow less than, or just something, all bad, is I think a little bit oversimplistic. It depends on who you were and what your life was like. And it's also an expression of like your values in terms of sense of community, in terms of togetherness, in terms of leadership development. In a way, under segregation, you sort of, people in East, I talk to old time people who live in East Austin, and they kind of miss it. I had someone told me, we were segregated, but we were free. And I think what she meant by that was that there was a sense of agency and belonging that didn't exist before. So in the 50s, the Tom Miller, as I said, he formed something called the Greater East Austin Development Committee. And the idea was to, I think he sincerely wanted to improve services there. However, as these things happen, it didn't work out that way. That committee ended up leading to the formation of the Urban Renewal Agency. And in the late 60s, the city began buying up property in East Austin, throwing people out of their homes using the right of eminent domain. How many of you have ever been by Huston-Tillotson College? Anyone? University? Do you notice that next door to it, it seems to be, as you're going toward the freeway, there are these kind of lots that look kind of empty? You ever notice them? Well, I've interviewed almost every family that lived in there. And the story they told me about how they lost their land is just, it breaks your heart. They used eminent domain. And so at one point, the city owned, I don't know, hundreds of properties in East Austin. This is before gentrification. And the point I want to make is that gentrification doesn't just happen. It isn't just a result of market forces. Usually other things have happened that kind of make an area prime for it. We are seeing now a movement in America for people who lost land to eminent domain to get it back. We had a big case in Long Beach. I think there's a case to be made here, but that isn't happening and that's not my job to do it. But there was the East Austin Development Association, but there were other activities in East Austin. And like I said, I'm working on something about life during Jim Crow. And if I had time, I'd show you the pictures and stuff, and you would get a sense of why there is this sort of longing for that sense of togetherness and agency. You'll hear it sometimes in what I call the original Black families of Austin. But the end of Jim Crow, I think in Austin, it came a little bit later. We're talking about the 70s. The major events in it to me were two things, because it shows the ambivalence of the end of segregation, I think, for Black people, the ambivalence. In 1971, the Black high school that they used to lure the Black people to East Austin was closed. Anderson High School. It closes. There's another Anderson, but the connection to the old one is not, is really not there. And then 3 years later in 1974, Wilhelmina Delco, who was on the school board, who did vote to actually close Anderson High School, was elected to the state legislature. Now, what's interesting about Delco was two things. First of all, She was the first Black person ever elected to the school board, and she was the first Black person elected from Travis County to the State House of Representatives. She was not from here. She's from Chicago. And I worked on her. I volunteered for a 74 campaign. I was going to UT at the time. And I spent most of my time skipping class, being an activist in East Boston. And I remember, and my introduction to that was her campaign. And what I remember about that campaign is who was involved and what it represented at the time. Her treasurer was Ann Richards, who became governor of Texas. Everybody who became significant in Democratic Party politics were associated with that campaign. She was also, look at her hair, she was wearing an afro then. She was also seen, at least by Black people, many Black people I've talked to, and particularly native Austinites who were Black and were poor. In other words, they didn't come from middle-class families. They really revered her because she didn't have any of that baggage. Like within any communities, there were class hierarchies. Some people were considered better than others. She didn't have any of that kind of attitude. People said she used to talk to the junkie on the street. She'd say hello to everybody. She was someone who brought people together in a way that people had not seen before. And so this was the time. How did that happen? At the same time in Austin, I'm sorry, these pictures these are pictures I got from the history, and I didn't buy them, so they have those things on them, so you can't sell them. What happened was there was a momentous time. We think of the late 60s, mid 60s to I think the mid 70s, on momentous times in the history of this country. Passage the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. We also had, and this was a huge one, was the 25th Amendment was ratified, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. Now in Austin at the time, city council members were elected at large. So when the student vote came in, it just changed this. It was like incredible. Just to give you an example, there was a city council election, I think in 1970, they run every 2 or 4 years, I can't remember. In 1975, the people who voted, there were 15,000 more people who voted in 1975 than the previous election. And a lot of them were students. So what do you think happened? You sort of went from a council that was led by what I call more center-right business, downtown business types, such as this man on the left, you see him with his hand up, that's the former Mayor Roy Butler. He owned a big car dealership, I guess he still does, to a council that looked like the people on the right. And from left to right, that's Jimmy Snell, the Black man. He's the first Black mayor pro tem of Austin. In between him is a woman named Emmylou Lynn, who was only the second woman ever elected to the city council. And to her right is Jeff Friedman. Now, Jeff Friedman, what we saw with the student vote was our leadership kind of shifted from kind of old line people who had long ties in Austin, your family name meant a lot, to more or less newcomers, a professional class of people. Many had come to the university, many had come for work in the IT sector. And then we had on top of this enfranchisement of the student vote. One of the people that is credited most with this changing is Jeff Friedman. He was going to UT. He managed to cut some sort of deal with who's over voter registration that allowed students to vote simply by stating that they intended to continue living in Austin. He registered a bunch of people and they came out and they voted. So this is when Austin began to get his reputation as being this liberal city. Matter of fact, Ramparts magazine, which was a big left-wing magazine at the time, referred to it as the third coast, as San Francisco and Texas. That's how different it seemed to people. This particular change didn't go over well with everybody. I mean, this kind of radical change, which is fairly quickly, people have a hard time adjusting these sorts of things. So, I mean, it wasn't all, everyone happy about it, but it was the reality. And it was into that environment. I'm sorry, we also got our first Latino council member in 1975. So it was into that environment that this movement to change the name of what was 19th Street for Martin Luther King began. Okay. Now, what happened was that in actually it was probably late 1974, a group of what I call, they were 30-something, they're all in their early 30s, late 20s, Black activists from East Austin formed a group called the Austin Black Assembly. And they only had one agenda item. And that was to rename what was 19th Street for Martin Luther King. They wanted to name it on both, as you know, 19th Street is a major thoroughway that connects East and West Austin. They wanted to rename the whole thing. It goes by the state capitol and by UT, and they said that's what we want to do. So they were actually supported by Wilhelmina Delco. Now, she was in the background. Two of the women involved in it worked for her. And, she said, yeah, go ahead. And she just kind of stood back and they did. So let me just ask you a question. This is a picture of them. There were originally 8 members. There are 4 left. There are 4 that I left, and I interviewed them in April. I'll show you a clip at the end of this presentation. But let me ask you a question. Does anyone, this picture to the left, does anyone know this guy right here in the middle with the glasses on and the beard? Anyone know who he is? Anyone recognize him?
Give us a hint.
Patty Hearst. His name is Cecil Williams, the Reverend Cecil Williams. He's actually from Texas. He actually was a chaplain at HT. But by this time, he was in San Francisco. He was the pastor, he's still alive, the pastor of Glide Memorial Methodist Church in downtown San Francisco in the Tenderloin. He was at that point, he was involved in negotiating. Remember Patty Hearst, the newspaper Hearst was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. Well, he was involved in negotiating between the police and the Symbionese Liberation Army for her release. Now, the first thing he did was, first thing they asked for was all this food for people. And one of the places where the food riots broke out, he was at his church. So he was at that point, the most radical Black preacher in America. He was extremely well known, at least among Black, but I think among white people as well. He hung out with Jane Fonda and all those people like that. But he had a connection here, so they invited him to town. But here they are, and I'll explain a little bit more about it later. And I just want to explain who everybody is. Now, to the left, the guy on the plaid shirt, coat, his name is Freddie Dixon. And Reverend Freddie Dixon. He's pastor of, does everyone know Freddie? Anyone know Freddie?
Yeah, I know of them, yeah.
Okay, so Freddie Dixon. Next to Freddie, the man is named Joel Bennett. He's an attorney at law. He used to be a judge.
Yeah.
And then in front of Joel is his ex-wife, Marla. I'm not gonna get into that. And then, and then next to Marla is Eva Lindsay. Okay, and then there's Cecil. And then the woman next to Cecil is a woman named Jeannie Pope. She's married to the great jazz musician, James Pope. And so I interviewed Jeannie, Joel, and Freddie in April for a video that we're going to show at UT at the end of the month. That's why I can't show you the whole thing. And it was just electric. It was so much fun. I find myself, the more, especially being a teacher, is that you're trying to get people interested in history, which you just hear about, you just want to go to sleep. But what I find is everyone's interested in how people lived, what people did, what they ate, where they went, their habits. That is interesting. Everyone's interested in families and things like this. And so I find that now I do a lot of genealogy work instead of history work, because I'm kind of interested in what do people actually do? And so in going around talking with people in Austin, and I've talked to probably a dozen sort of native Black Austinites and other people who've been involved in the movement a while. And the sense I get is much richer than I can from these facts of what terrible things happened to them because they were Black. But at any rate, I should point out that Jeannie and Eva are Austin natives. Their family's always been here. Joel was an ex-military officer who came here to go to law school. He had literally been in town 1 year when he got involved with this. He was a second-year law student when he did all this. And Freddie was also not from here. He's from actually a long-standing civil rights family from Tennessee. But at any rate, they got together after everyone was very galvanized by Wilhelmina Delco being elected. And it sort of, in a way, unleashed a kind of a new generation of leadership. You didn't have to be, you didn't have to, teach at HT. You didn't have to, be a so-called respectable person to be a leader. People were starting to just generally rise up. You didn't have to have a big name or anything. And you started seeing more people becoming engaged in community activism, not just the, the who's-its, as they would say. And so these folks came together. They actually met in her office. Her office, Wilhelm E. Douglas office, I think her district office was on 11th or 12th Street, I can't remember. They actually met there. And that's when they came up with this idea to do this. And they just wanted to do the one thing. So what happened was they originally petitioned the council just to rename this. They wanted to rename the entire street. But what was happening at the time was the city council elections were still going on. And what happened was there was a runoff. And so they didn't think they would have the votes. So they originally petitioned the council to rename the street just on the east side of the freeway. And they used the time then to build more support in the community to rename the entire street. So the council did, and no one had a problem with that really. But then, you know, all hell broke loose. When they had a public hearing again later in April of 75, a lot of people came out and said, no, we can rename the whole street, which is what they originally wanted to do. And so then a group of business owners on the west side called the West 19th Street Business Association began to raise a ruckus. They went to court. They said the council didn't have the authority to do that, blah, blah, blah. But the council nonetheless, in late April of 1975, voted to rename the entire street. Then, so let's talk about this. First, I want to talk about the significance of the streets. I'm going on and on. This is a list. I talked to a urban geographer named Derek Alderman. He's an expert on Martin Luther King streets. There are almost 1,000 streets in America named for Martin Luther King. There are maybe 60 named for him around the world. 1,000 streets, can you believe it? And most of this happened in the 60s. And then more recently, you're seeing an uptick of Martin Luther King streets in Latino neighborhoods. It's very interesting. But almost all of those streets only run in Black and impoverished communities. That's it. Very few of them run in white neighborhoods. And even fewer run by or near a state capital. And I think Austin's is one of the only ones that runs by a state capital and major university. So here are the states where you have Martin Luther King streets that run by state cap: Texas, Arkansas, Florida, Minnesota, actually Minnesota, Tennessee, actually the address of the Tennessee state legislature is Martin Luther King Boulevard, and Wisconsin. That's it. And again, Dr. Halderman can't say for sure. Academics are more cautious than journalists. He said it's probably unique. Maybe one other place, but he's not sure. So people study these things. And the significance of Martin Luther King Boulevard in Austin, I think is huge because it's totally unique. It's totally unique. Now, I'm going to stop here. When the ABA decided to undertake this activity, they invited Cecil Williams to first come to Austin for their commemorative anniversary event for Martin Luther King's assassination. It was in April of 1975 that they had it at Rosewood Center. And he was electrifying. I happened to be interning at the American Statesman at the time. And I remember him coming to town because he spoke on campus, and it was hot ticket because he was the radical preacher that was hanging out with, the Symbionese Liberation Army. Can you imagine? I mean, your kids, it was very exciting. It's like the movement came to Austin. And I remember going to see him, and then I went over to the Rosewood where he spoke for this commemoration. He was, the building was shaking. People were really into him. And so after he left, he was such a hit. And after this opposition to this renaming the entire street began, the group decided to invite him back to Austin for the Juneteenth celebration in 1976. What I should point out is that the opposition to the street naming began like in late April 1975, and it continued until December of 1976. So it went on and on, these court cases, these petitions, blah, 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 opposition. So they brought back Cecil to the Juneteenth celebration in 1976. And I have a clip here of what he said, a little bit of his speech. And I like to show it because it just gives you a whole flavor of the times. I just want to start playing the Isley Brothers when I see it.
brothers and my sisters, I want to tell you something. If you're liberated, you will make sure that the Martin Luther King Boulevard becomes a reality in Austin, Texas. One of the problems in the Deep South is that they have moved further than Austin, Texas. They got schools named after King. They got avenues named after King. They got recreation centers named after King. They're naming all kinds of things after Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And here in Austin, you still sitting around deliberating about whether or not you want the avenue. If there are white people who have businesses on Martin Luther King Avenue who don't want it to be named Martin Luther King Avenue, you ought to boycott those businesses and make sure that they understand that it's your money that they put in their pockets.
So I see some things. Is Karen Brannon on here? Oops, I don't want to repeat myself. Is Karen Brannon on with us today?
Yes. Hey, Erna.
Where are you?
You don't recognize me. It's been so long.
Lord
I'm
have
right
mercy.
here.
I'm looking for you. I don't see you. I'll see you later. I met
Okay.
Karen and I were involved in all kind of clandestine things. That 1 year I lived in Minnesota. She almost got me fired from my job carrying on with that girl. But
Erna and I have some stories to
Oh,
not
yeah.
tell.
we have some stories to tell. Thank you so much for joining us, Karen. So, there was Cecil talking, and you just sort of did thoroughly a flavor of the times from watching him. At least I do. Now I'm trying to figure out when I go to my next slide. Oh, what's happening here? Anyone know how I should get rid of this? Okay, here I'm on my next slide. Now, today, the story of how the street renamed is pretty much begins and ends with the death of this man, Dr. J.J. Seabrook. Does anyone know who he is? Anyone tell me who he is? There's a lot of stuff named after him here. I live in Mueller Village, and there's this J.J. Seabrook Greenbelt. I, take walks and ride my bike there all the time. J.J. Seabrook was at the time of his death, he was the president emeritus of Houston Tillotson College. He was, as such, as an educated man, he was definitely considered, at least at one point, especially during the time of segregation, a noted, quote, Negro leader. He was the kind of person that could, as some of my people I've interviewed said, he was one of those, quote, pardon my French, Negroes who could cross the bridge and talk to the white folk. That was how he was referred to. And he was a respectable man. I've seen pictures of him with LBJ and all this other kind of stuff. But by this time he had retired. He was not really on the scene. He had long-time relationships with people in the white power structure. And one of them was a man named Bud Dryden. Bud Dryden was at that point mayor pro tem of Austin. He was a physician, a very noted physician. And Dr. Dryden his practice was basically, he treated Black people. That's what he did. He was the Black doctor. He had an office on East Avenue, which became I-35. And I talked to, again, original, very sort of senior citizens, Black people of Austin, and they refer to him as the man who delivered every Black baby in East Austin. This is an exaggeration, of course, but his relationship to Black people, his so-called closeness, was enough in the eyes, at least of white Austinites, to make him a leader of sorts of Black people. So as we know, the council was elected by then at large. And in a sense, before we started actually having real Black council members, the Black council member was allegedly, Dr. Dryden. So what happened was Dr. Dryden was in a runoff for mayor with Jeff Friedman. And he didn't think naming the entire street was going to go over well west of the freeway. So, and he sort of knew that was what they wanted to do. And so he asked Dr. Seabrook, he told Dr. Seabrook these people were going to destroy the city, that they were, quote, hoodlums. And so Dr. Seabrook initially went to them and tried to talk them out of it. Dr. Seabrook they actually were able to turn him around, and he ended up supporting the movement to rename the entire street. But initially he was against it and was sent to call them off. Dr. Seabrook is noted, is so well known in this particular saga because he actually died testifying in favor of renaming the street. He basically dropped dead on the floor of the city council on May 1st, 1975, testifying in favor of renaming this entire street. Now, that meeting was interesting because they'd already voted to rename the entire street, but then the opposition from the white business community came up. And so they had this other meeting, which the street naming wasn't exactly on the agenda, but they have that open comment section where everyone can talk about everything. And that's when the opposition on the west side really sort of beamed up. Now, the people in the Austin Black Assembly, they kind of found out about it at the last minute. So there weren't that many Black people in the room when that happened. The meeting before was jam full of Black people just testifying in favor of naming those streets, but that one kind of slipped up on people. So Seabrook was able to get there, and so were Jeannie Polk and Eva Lindsay. And she was there with Tommy Wyatt, who was still is the editor and publisher of the Black newspaper, The Villager. So they were there. Seabrook was the last person to talk, and he collapsed and later died. So I am going to, I think this is the next slide. Let me see. Okay, I'm just gonna talk about this and then is it the next one? What happened to this? Okay. Where's the link to the other one? Okay, there's Cecil. Sorry about that. Having a hard time. I'm going to take you all out of here for a second. Let me see if I can find it correctly. No, okay, I'll have to show you. I'll have to show you that. All right. Oh, this always happens. Doesn't it always happen? Let me see if it's the next. I got on the next slide. No. Oh, I know what I was going to do. Okay. Let me take this down. If I can figure out how to do it. That's why I should always have a child with me when I'm doing things like this. I can't, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you about a 7-minute clip from this interview I did with the ABA. And they're talking about that day in the city council meeting when Dr. Seabrook died. And they're also talking about the significance of his death and what they think, what the street means to them now. Okay. So I'm going to go to this. It's about a 7-minute clip. So I hope we don't fall asleep. The audio quality is not the best. We did the interview outside at actually the John Chase house. John Chase was a pioneering Black architect in the city. Has a number of buildings on the east side, which if you go on the Preservation Austin tour, I highly recommend you go see some of his buildings. They were really lovely examples of mid-century modern architecture. But anyway, we were outside, the wind was blowing, and so some of it kind of fades out. But I think it gives you a sense of the emotion, the feeling of being in the room when that happened, and also what it meant to the people who were involved. So here we go. I should warn you, it does begin with some fairly disturbing pictures of Dr. Seabrook's collapsing. Okay. So let me come up and let me begin it. Okay. What did you observe and experience in that meeting when he got up to speak? What happened?
He stood up and he raised his head and he raised his head and fell. And he fell like that. And I started screaming. But I saw him die. And I started screaming. And I don't think anybody else was screaming. I don't know. It didn't matter. And I said, and he hit the floor. And I said, y'all killed the man. The motherfucker killed the man. You know, he's trying to be nice, and y'all killed him. You know, you can't be nice to white people. And so my mouth just never did close. It really didn't.
Jim told me why it slapped you.
I wanted to slap her.
Yeah.
I'm scrapping. Cause she should have shut the hell up. He died. She should have shut up. Dead.
And
Gotta
she-
get away
And
from,
she couldn't.
get away from him.
She was all in her emotions. She couldn't show it.
You know?
And you stayed in the room.
Yes.
Yes, he-
Why, and what did you see?
Well, I did not think he was being conciliatory. I think he was trying to support us
you know,
and didn't know how. I do believe he was sorry for the stance he had taken previously. I do believe he was sorry for what he had said. I do believe he understood what they had tried to do. He understood, finally. And he didn't know what to say to us to let us know he understood. I really do. And I felt bad for him. I really felt bad for him.
And why did you stay?
Because he needed somebody, he was dying. He needed somebody on his side. He didn't need to be alone.
Did you go to school
No, no. I would not have wanted them to leave me there had I been dying. I would have wanted somebody to be by my side. I would never have left him alone. No.
Yeah.
You don't leave, like the Marines say, you don't leave a fallen soldier behind. And he was a falling soldier. He knew they had betrayed him. He knew that. And he was trying to let us know that he knew that. He just didn't know how to say what he needed to say.
And when you mean he said he knew they betrayed it, that because of the council's kind of waffling on their early agreement to rename Cole
Mhm.
Street? Okay, all right,
And he couldn't ever get a positive response. Right.
okay. I remember that reading the notes, he was the last speaker,
Yeah, he couldn't get a.
and they were shuffling their notes, trying to get out
Oh,
to
yes.
leave.
They wanted to get away.
Yeah.
They wanted to get what they wanted to do. And Dr. Biden sat there, storage.
He wasn't there, right?
No, Dryden wasn't there the
He
last
wasn't
day.
at that meeting.
The
No.
coward.
No, he wasn't there at that meeting. No, no. But they were, they definitely, they were trying to get out of there.
Yes.
And so
I
He
felt
was the
bad
last
for
speaker.
him, and I knew he was sorry for what he had done. But he knew that they had
used him?
used him. And I did not want to, and when he was going down, it was like in my heart, I knew this was it, his last stand. I knew it. I just felt this was it for him. I don't know how, because I'm not no doctor and I ain't that smart. But I felt like this was it for him. I really did. And I wasn't gonna leave him there by himself. How could you do that?
Yeah, I
I
understand.
couldn't leave him there by
Didn't have any
himself.
children.
No, they didn't have any children. Mm-mm.
You know, they prided themselves with some nieces and nephews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the children that they
Correct.
dealt with
Dealt
through
with
their
it.
career.
And like you were a great admirer of his wife
Yes.
as a teacher.
And I admired him along the way.
Yeah.
At the school, at
Yeah,
at Houston Tillotson, because he did some good things
He
for
did.
some children.
Uh-huh.
He just got on my last nerve through this
Incident.
incident.
Mhm.
What impact do you think Seabrook's death had on your campaign? What
It
impact?
helped to pass that.
I think
Didn't have to pass.
They made him a martyr.
Yeah.
He
'cause
became a martyr.
They were not
And
gonna pass it.
They never gonna,
Because even though they voted to pass it.
Yeah.
he became a martyr.
Yeah.
And you know what happens to a martyr.
When I talked to you at your home, after walking down the rickety stairs,
Why you got to mention that?
you said that.
Why you got to mention that, Gene?
Well,
Why did she-
I'm sorry. You're right. I shouldn't have mentioned that. That's not very God-centered of me. When I talked to you, you said that every time you drive down Martin Luther King Boulevard, you think about God's joke.
He is so funny.
What did you mean by that?
What did I tell you?
Tell us.
Well, when you think about it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Brother Seabrook, he died. All those people crossed, we can say they crossed the river
Yeah.
coming to East Austin to stop something. It's like they crossed that river, Jordan, but they didn't stop nothing, did they?
No, they didn't.
Seabrook died, unfortunately. But they named the bridge after him.
So that,
We got the street named after him.
Yeah.
After all that they went through.
Still
So God's
succeed.
laughing,
Yeah.
ain't
We
he?
still succeed.
Ain't he smiling about that?
Yeah.
I think so.
All that they went through,
They didn't stop us.
crossing that river. And some up drowning, like Dr. Seabrook did. But that street was changed.
That's right.
It wasn't it?
Amen.
Every time I drive by there, I crack up and laugh.
Find something in life that excites you. That gets your blood going. Whether it's financial, non-financial, religious, whatever. And go do it. It will stick with you for a lifetime.
Hello. Hello. That's nice. Could you hear it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was kind of worried about the audio, but that sort of gives you an idea of like what it was, what it's like when you can talk to people who witness something. It comes alive in a way that facts can't just give you. The feeling of being in the room. I also saw it as an example of how the white leadership west of the freeway had changed to a more like progressive, let's say maybe more left-leaning kind of thing, but it happened on the Black side of town as well. And this was, to me, this clash with them and Seabrook struck me as a generational clash, as opposed to like, anything else. But now, today, their whole role as the Austin Black Assembly in changing this has essentially been subsumed by this story of Seabrook, which is, let's face it, a stunning story. Who dies trying to get a street renamed for Martin Luther King? It's extraordinary. But at the same time, I think because the city has changed so much, because we have essentially lost our Black population, let's just be frank, that it's very easy for these stories to be reframed and repositioned and made something that they aren't. That ends up in a way devaluing the contributions of Black people developing the city because it comes about one guy. The same thing has really in a way happened to King's legacy. But for me, in what motivated me the most in doing this was that I knew that Dr. Seabrook was not on the right side of this issue initially. I remember. He struck me as an you know, an older man who was more of a conciliatory to white people than, you know, than I was going to be at my particular age. And so I kind of knew that. And I always thought it was sort of amazing when I came back. I should pack up. I left Texas in 1984, I believe it was. And I didn't move back here to live until 2015.
Wow.
And even though I'd been back and forth in and out of Austin, to get here, and I'd seen how it had changed, to get here and to suddenly find yourself in the least Black city I ever lived in since I lived in Minnesota in 1981 was a kind of a stunning thing. I'm walking in places in East Austin and people are looking at me like I'm the stranger. It was a sense of being utterly disoriented and feeling, you know, visibly invisible in a way. It's stuff I hadn't experienced. I've been living in New York and California, and I was never the only one in the room. Hardly ever was the only one in the room that had a little melanin in their pigment. It was very seldom that I even found myself in those. And here, I'm surrounded by it all the time. And it really got to me. It really started to bother me. You know, to the point to where, you know, there's certain parts of East Austin I just don't go to. I'm going to get triggered. And so in a way, you know, for me, the street has become, it is the most visible symbol that there were Black people in Austin. Not only were they here, they contributed to creating this landmark that has given the city a special flavor. You know, Austin, you know, you come to Austin, I have my white students always tell me, you know, they're always so proud they live in the city that has Martin Luther King Street that runs in a white neighborhood. But in the meanwhile, we don't have many Black people. There's a lot of reasons for that. We could talk about that in the question and answers, I believe. So in a way, you know, sociologists talk about, they call it toponyms. Is that the right way to say it? In other words, they're sort of symbols, you know, in our urban geography, you know, street names, statues and all this stuff. And I remember when all the business about pulling down the Confederate statues started heating up. I don't know about you, but at the time I'm like, who looks at these damn statues? I don't care. I never looked at them. You know, I knew it was, sorry, you know, the history belongs to whoever wins. So I didn't have any expectations of them. And at first I was like, oh, whatever. But, you know, as we get into the summer of George Floyd and all these things started happening, and I'm sort of hanging on, I'm sort of realizing and sort of delving into things, you realize how important these things are, these symbols, these streets. You know, they represent not only our history, but the ideals that we, as a people, say we ascribe to. We want to be like this. So this street is, to me, not only a symbol of that and the city, but also, to me, it ends up being a memorial to the Black community of Austin. And so that's why I sort of got into it as much as I did. So that's really all I have for now. And if there's any questions or anybody wants to add anything, I saw some comments here about Dr. Dryden, and it's true. I must say about him, there were doctors like him all across the South. Everybody who grew up in the South was one Black doctor who treated the Black, one white doctor treated the Black people. There was always one. Interesting story about Earl Campbell, the great running back. He was actually named by the white doctor that delivered him. And that was not the name his mother wanted to give him. I mean, it was so these things went on, and he was, for his time, a good person. There's no question about it. But the time of that sort of leadership of him deciding what was right for Black people, that time had totally slipped by 1975. So I just want to end there. And any questions and any feedback on the, thanks for the feedback on the interviews. I was kind of concerned about it. I'm doing some more with people that are really interesting. I'd like to do basically a series of them with different people, because I think that when they speak, especially as they speak with this, there's such a richness in their voice. How can you not feel what they're feeling as you listen to them speak? And it takes away all the other stuff, all the stuff on our head about politics and being uncomfortable and blah, blah, blah. When people talk to you like that, what we're into, I hope, is our humanity. Plain and simple. So thank you for listening. questions?
Erna, I have a question, just a logistical question. Thank you so much for your presentation. When and where is your presentation at UT?
It's on November the 29th. It's at the Warfield Center on campus.
Okay.
And I will make sure to send a note to Jeannie. That'd be nice if you want to come.
Yeah.
Question.
Oh,
Are you finished, Amelia? Sort of a general sense of the country question. We moved here in 74 and have, to be honest, almost no memory of the events you've just been talking about. But in 1972, Bishop Ernest Dixon, who was Freddie's father, became bishop of this whole area of the Methodist Church. And I'm guessing that the Black population of Austin in that time was what, 15, 18%, as much as 20?
Yes, up to
Yeah.
20.
So I guess what I'm saying, I think the naming of Martin Luther King, and I want you to correct me, was because of his very much national prominence. It didn't really have a lot to do, unless you tell me otherwise, with the respect for activity or what was going on in the Black community here, except for they obviously were the people who pushed so hard appropriately to get it done. But I guess I'm trying to say, we got MLK Boulevard because of Martin Luther King's national prominence, or because all these worker bees here?
I think that's a really good question. First of all, most cities started changing street names for him in the late 60s.
Sure.
Not long after he was assassinated. So we were a little bit late. Austin was a bit late. That was kind of an embarrassment for the city. So I think they were a little bit embarrassed. I think in terms of what motivated people was just this, well, how would I put it? I think there was a general sense of, renewed sense of agency and activism that was happening all across the city, including in the Black community. And that was something people could do. When I actually asked, how did you come about doing that? I've heard all sorts of stories about it. So I really don't know. I really honestly don't know. But what I do know is that it symbolized a sort of a switch in a generational shift in leadership and style in terms of how do you confront white power. Yeah, that's the main thing I know about it.
Well, totally unrelated tidbit, except to me because I knew him. But the last principal of the old Anderson High School, T.C. Calhoun, became the principal of a Murchison Middle School after Anderson closed. Just the way it was, that was the way I think they were doing a good job, but whether they could have gotten away with any more prominent job for Mr. Calhoun, I know not, but.
Aria, I knew Mr. Calhoun. I think he went to church with my parents. I think I met him. I remember the name TC.
Correct.
He was a lovely man.
Yes, and his wife lived into her 90s, and their daughter, Pat Calhoun, still runs around Austin.
Actually, I'm friends with Pat.
No.
Pat, she lives in the, I think the Roberts Washington Historic District. It's right off of Martin Luther, it's right off of MLK, like around, right off of MLK at, I can't remember the cross streets there, Maple and all that. And Pat is, I've interviewed her, I think 3 times now. And she still lives in the house that her father built.
Really, did not know that.
It is something to see, because you know how they built then was that, you know, it was a smaller house, and then as they got money, they just added on to it. And it is it's an exquisite example of mid-century modern, again, architecture on the inside, sliding doors. I love going to her house. She still works. She's an interior designer just for commercial stuff. And as the Lovely's very active in getting the historic designation for that neighborhood. That neighborhood was where, you know, John King, who was president of HT and also his family owned a big funeral home, they still own it, King Tears, lived. All of your prominent so-called Black people lived in there. And that was also in that neighborhood where that cyclist shot the other one because it was something about a boyfriend recently. And Mrs. Calhoun was one of the first person I talked to after the shooting happened. And she said, you let the white people in the first thing, next thing you know, they start shooting. There goes the neighborhood. We never should have let those bicyclists in here.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you for your presentation today. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Oh, someone raised their hand? I'm sorry. Yes.
I've got one more question, but I know somebody, I've already asked one, so I can ask again in a minute after other people have gone.
I'd like your comments on why has the Black, from your thoughts, why has there been an exodus of Black people from Austin?
I think it's really a number of things combined. I should say that the biggest drop happened between 2000 and 2010. We saw in East Austin, in one zip code, the Black population dropped by 60% in 10 years. So bad that the city actually commissioned a report to say, well, we need to get some Black, it's terrible, the Black people are all leaving. That was, people ascribe that to gentrification, but people often think gentrification is something that just happens. It doesn't. It's to me, it's usually a couple of things that usually go into a rapid gentrification. East Austin had, in my opinion, been primed for gentrification for years. I started seeing it myself. It really started in the 50s with this whole urban renewal movement, moving people out. Because you know what happens is the same thing happened every place. The centers, everyone moved out of the cities. And then they all started coming back. That is one of the best locations in Austin, is east of the freeway. And I knew that in college going across. I mean, I went to college with I went to college with Earl Campbell. He was later. The first one I remember, big football player, was Roosevelt Leaks. And Roosevelt, in college, bought property on 12th. He said, oh, this is going to turn over. These white people are coming, and I'm going to make, he did. He made a bunch of money. So you could see it. So it's some of that. There was also, I do think that integration played a part, but not as much as people think. If you have the opportunity to go buy a big house someplace else, why wouldn't you do it? Some people did. Many people did. So there was that. But I generally think that the same thing has displaced Black people from the city, the same thing has displaced anybody who doesn't make $100,000 a year. You can't afford it. So people move in, suddenly your property rates, your property taxes go up. You can't even afford the property, even if you don't have even if you don't have a mortgage. Joel Bennett, the lawyer that I told you about, he's still practicing law. Joel's 78. And he said his biggest practice now is saving people from getting thrown out of their homes because they took a reverse mortgage.
Oh, gee.
So I think a lot of things, but I think generally speaking, the same market factors that made cities unaffordable for, a lot of people now out of reach is the same thing that sort of happened, compounded with a sort of a legacy that's happened to Black people. That's my short answer. I wish I knew more. The person who has studied this the most is a professor that works at UT. His name is Eric Tang, T-A-N-G. If you just Google him, or even just go on YouTube, put in Eric Tang, he talks about it, and he has the numbers to back it up. So I remember in 2010 when that happened, because I was living in LA then, and I remember someone sent me a story, a link to a story about this report the city does about how can we get more Black people moving. And I said, Austin's the only city in the world where they're actually doing a report about how to get more Black people. I just laughed when I read it. It was just so Austin. And of course, it didn't mean anything. There's no more people here than ever. I do know it as a Black person living, whenever I meet someone else who's like not from here, it doesn't really take but a minute for the conversation to go to, there's no Black people here, and how weird that seems to people. So I think it's an odd thing. I think it's a shame. I don't know what will change it, but I think that, like I said, and generally speaking, it's kind of the same story for people who don't have as much money anywhere you go in America, in a city. Don't you think?
Right.
I saw a hand up over here. I'm sorry, here. I don't know. I can't see your name, but I could see your hand up. Oh,
I have
Angela.
my hand. Oh. Or maybe it was me. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and ask my question because I don't have the stuff on my hand. So, okay, thank you. I'm going round two for my question. So I've been watching this because of our Examining White Privilege group that Jenny and Pam started. There was recommended to me the PBS documentary series, Making Black America, and lots of talk about Black joy and how much the narrative is usually centered around you know,
Loss.
yes, exactly. So you mentioned Black joy, and if it's not too personal, would you be willing to share some joyful moments in your own research of this project? I'd love to hear some moments of in your own, you know,
Oh, yeah.
experience and research of doing this.
Yes, there's one comes to mind. It doesn't involve anybody who you've seen. I will say in general, Jeannie Polk, meeting her was just been a hoot. And she doesn't live far from me. So, you know, I have this great friend in her. I made this great friend in her and her husband. And I've been to see him play any number of times now. He's in his 80s. That man still can take on. He used to be the musical director for Ray Charles. This guy is just, and not known in Austin, should be revered. This guy, unbelievable. Hanging out with them. Oh my God, so much fun. But I think the funnest story was, I met a man named, gosh, no, his name's, I hate getting old. The names leave you. What is his name? I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, he was the first Black FBI agent from Texas ever. He is 88, I think. I wish I could still remember his name. Mr. Porter. I just call him Mr. Porter. He lives in Pflugerville. His meeting him, he had a resume and it was just a long list of first. The first this, the first that. But that wasn't what he was bragging about. His most prized possession was an autographed picture he had with Althea Gibson, the great Black tennis player, because he is a tennis player. He still coaches every day kids at the Pflugerville girls tennis team, which is the coach is the daughter of the man who coached Zena Garrison, the great Black tennis player from Houston. So it's things like that. Meeting Mr. Porter, Alex Porter is his name. I have to say that was for me. He's a vegan, which he told me that's why he's 88 and still has good knees. And he can shoot a gun. I went to a shooting range with him just to see. You know, I don't shoot a gun, but he was saying I should learn. And I've never played tennis. I don't play tennis well. But for me, that was a really moment of joy. Also, and I could show it to you. I sort of got into this through a family that I know here. That's one of what some people refer to as the original Black people here. Their families called the Lindsays. And I found their father took the most amazing photographs and movies. And I have about, I don't know, 2,000 photos. And now I have 2.5 hours of film that he took. To look at those. And what do you see in the pictures? What you see is a picture of post-World War II prosperity. You know, there's the swing set from Sears in there, you know, there's the girls at Christmas with their dolls, you know, there's them at their, you know, tap dancing recital. There's every recital, every event he went to. He was an electrician. And when you look at it, what struck me, and it filled me full of joy, but what really struck me was we look at that and we see if they had been white, it would have just been what America was at that time. And so for me, the joy has been in experiencing those moments like that with people, having the unique privilege of people just turning over their scrapbook to you and sharing with them their lives. And what has inspired in me is this notion that each of us carries inside us these personal histories, these memories of events. We are defined by them to some extent. And that it's very important, I think, especially at our age, you know, I'm very happy to be on the sidelines, that when we have these opportunities to collect and share our stories, that we do. I've been utterly inspired. I wish you could meet Mr. Porter. That guy, he makes you want to be hopeful. And his life was not an easy street. But to listen to him talk now, to watch him, to see how sharp he is in his mind, to see his still zest for life and for wanting to share what he knows and to still working with young people, that absolutely gave me tremendous joy.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. I'll have to show you this. If you want to, I'll send you the pictures of, they used to have a little Black Miss East Austin contest. And one of the Lindsay's sisters' little girl was in it. She's now 50. And you should have seen her face when I showed her those photos. Oh, Beautiful. Beautiful.
Any other questions, guys? Erna,
I'm gonna
thank
put-
you.
I'm gonna put my email address in here.
Thanks.
And if you have any questions or comments, and thank you for looking at the video. I was really kind of worried about how that's going to go over. We'll see. If you have any questions or comments, any feedback on the video, I'd really appreciate having it. Thank you so much for listening and joining me today.
Okay.
And you know, Karen, you look the same. Too. She has the same haircut she had at night, same haircut